Hello, I'm Claire Chase. I'm a flutist and an advocate for new and experimental music. And I'm delighted to be doing this online masterclass for Speak Percussion's Sounds Unheard series. That was a little excerpt, just a little snippet of the tail end of a piece by the late, great Pauline Oliveros. It's called A Fluting Moment, and it's for a flutist or any number of flutists. We will take a look at the score for this piece a little bit later on in the session and invite you to play along with me in a version. But I wanted to begin with it because it's always nice to begin with music before we speak, and because the piece asks the flutist to explore not just the aerophonic capabilities of the instrument. This is an instrument that we put air through, right? But also its percussive abilities. And in addition to that, the piece asks us to think about our aerophonic and also percussive sounds in an environment, in a room, in response to things, objects, presences, and sounds around us when we perform. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about in this session today. And I should say by way of introduction also that the Sounds Unheard series is intended for high school students. And so I've designed this session with that age group in mind. But if you are any age and interested in contemporary music, interested in exploring new sounds and ideas and trying them on for size, you are most welcome to listen on. So we're going to talk today about percussive techniques, how to turn this instrument into an expressive aerophone and also an expressive drum. And we're going to look at techniques, yes, but also some poetic prompts for improvisation and noise making and experimentation. And we'll look at works by Pauline Oliveros, by Edgard Varèse, and by some younger composers that I've developed relationships with in the past few years. So first I want to tell you about my discovery of the percussive qualities of this instrument. It actually came quite late for me. I was 13 years old, and my teacher, John Fonville, at the time, walked into my flute lesson and put these 2 pages of music on the music stand. And I looked at them, and I thought, what is this? This doesn't look like music. It didn't have any licks in it, didn't have any arpeggios in it. It had all these really high notes, really low notes, extreme dynamics, this funny plus sign about halfway through over a couple of notes in the bottom of the first page. And I thought, what is this? This doesn't look like anything. And he said, don't judge before you listen. Do you want to hear it? And I said, yeah, of course I want to hear it. And he said, okay, kiddo, stand back. And so I stood back, and the next 4.5 minutes changed my life. His performance of this piece proceeded to blow the roof off of my musical imagination and completely redefine what I thought this little tube of metal was capable of. Not just an instrument of lyricism and beauty, but also an agent of power, of raw vulnerability, if you will. He was able to turn the flute into something that sounded like a city siren. He was able to turn it into something that sounded like a wailing human voice. At another time, he was able to turn it into something that sounded like a trumpet or a trombone. And at this pivotal moment, in the middle of the piece, he was able to turn it into a drum. So let's take a look at this piece. Let's give a listen to it, and we'll unpack a couple of these things. This is Density 21.5 by Edgard Varèse. So there's so many things to talk about in this piece. For me, what made it a before and after moment in my life, what made it transformative, was to think of the flute, to experience also bodily the flute as a trumpet, as a trombone, as a city siren, as a wailing human voice, and also in this critical moment halfway through the piece, as a drum. Varèse turns the instrument into a drum. And let's unpack this technique a little bit. You know, it's funny that for me, I had to wait until I was 13 years old to realize that the simplest sound on the instrument that anybody can make who's just picking up a flute for the first time is music. And each one of these keys, and each combination of keys, is a tremendously beautiful and distinct sound. We can also play these with dynamics. We can play clicks, and we can play the flute like a drum, with lyricism and with line and with legato, with all the properties that we think of as existing in aerophone music and in played toned music. And so what Varèse does is everything stops, all this blowing stops, and we hear silence, and then right after the silence we hear. So you can do this by just fingering an E, and the simplest way is just, right? And then you finger a C sharp. You can click any one of these keys. If you have the C sharp key down, any one of these keys will actually make that interval. They all have different qualities. And so I like to use different fingerings for different sized rooms, different acoustics. We're in a really small room right now, so I'm going to do a little trick, which is to depress the G key. I'm holding down the E, and then I'm clicking the G key, which gives it a nice resonant and actually lower pitch quality. Different from, right? And if you really want to make a lot of sound, you can add a little bit of lip percussion to this as well. So for instance, like this. Right? Now, there are different ideas and different interpretations of the way that this should be played. I like to think of it as a response to the room, response to the acoustics, response to other sounds and energies that are in the room, and how I can communicate this passage the best. So what I suggest you do is, first of all, just explore each of the sounds of these keys. And then you can gradually add a little bit of tongue pizzicato to it, trying specifically to do the thing that you're taught to do on the flute, which is to make a tone. You're trying to actually not make a tone. So what I suggest is that to get the sound, that pizzicato sound, is to actually practice it away from the instrument. You just do it by drawing the tongue directly through the teeth, just far away from the flute. Like you're spitting sunflower seeds or something, right? And then just gradually bring the flute closer to your mouth. You can do it with different vowels. E, A, O all have different sounds. And then I like to open my mouth because it almost turns the mouth into its own little loudspeaker, right? So instead of just going, right, where the sound goes, I go, right? And you can do that by keeping your embouchure. You keep the flute nice and solid here, and then just open your mouth. And it's wonderful that on that third note in the triplet, in the second figure, Varèse asks us to play a tone. And then. The other thing I'd ask you to experiment with here, and have fun with this is music, have fun with it, is to think about not just the sounds, but the silences in between the sounds. You know, we think of staccato, it's a term you've probably learned in your lessons, as meaning short. Well, sure, it means short, but the actual definition of staccato from the Oxford Dictionary of Music is the substitution of silence for sound to a greater or lesser degree. Isn't that wonderful to think about silence being substituted for sound? And the to a greater or lesser degree part is you. That's your interpretation. That's your choice that you make about where the silence joins and transforms the sound. So I like to think of it as the difference between passive silence and active silence. So here's passive silence. Right? I'm relaxing in between each silence. I'm not playing musically in the silences. But if I charge each one of those silences and I really think about where I'm substituting silence for sound, and I give silence the same amount of love that I'm giving the sound, something else happens. So play with that and have fun with it, think about it, record yourself, listen to it, and use it as a springboard for generating more ideas. So, we talk about these sounds as extended techniques. That's probably a term that you've heard too. Speaking of questioning, I've always questioned the use of that word because, once you extend the instrument, what are you extending? So when we learn a new word, do we call it an extended vocabulary because we've learned a new word? No, we learn that word, we use it in a sentence, and then more important than using it in a sentence, we use it to tell a story. And then it comes into our possession when we're trying to describe something mysterious and beautiful to someone else, when we're trying to share. And so perhaps you could think about a technique like this, and like some of the other ones that we'll go over today, as just new words in your vocabulary. And as musicians, it's really, really important to keep expanding our vocabularies. Everything that we hear actually becomes a part of how we sound, how we communicate without words when we have an instrument in our hands and when we're sharing something that's inside of us. So think about it less as an extended technique that you have to learn and more like, here's this new little tool that I have that I can create new tools from. So that's Varèse. I encourage you to play around with these sounds, make them your own. And also think about what Mozart said, that music is not in the notes, it's in the silences in between. So this is not just about contemporary music and new sounds, this is also about the history of music. You can, if you want to have a lot of fun, apply some of these techniques to earlier music. When I discovered this wonderful little drumming sound in the Varèse, I also discovered that I could add that into 19th century music that I was studying. For instance, the famous Caprice No. 24 by Paganini. Try that again. There's a variation later on that the violinist plays with a left-hand pizzicato. And now that we know this flute technique that Varèse showed us, we can incorporate that into music from a previous era and sound more like violin and less like a flute, like this. Then piano. So you can have lots of fun with it, and I encourage you to play around.